Everybody, good afternoon. I am really pleased to welcome you to Unprecedented Times, Unprecedented Partnerships. My name is Lee Christian Parker. I'm the Senior Vice President, Philanthropic Client Manager for DC, Maryland, and Virginia at Bank of America Private Bank. Before we begin, let me first thank Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers Corporate Affinity Group for producing this wonderful event, and specifically Todd Pittman, Director, Corporate and Foundation Advancement for Washington Grantmakers, for his coordination and leadership. I am privileged to join you today to moderate a conversation with three powerhouse women who continue to give of their time, talent, and resources to ensure that every member of our community has what they need to enjoy the quality of life they desire for themselves and their family. COVID-19 has presented unconscionable challenges for the fabric of our nation. Core to keeping each thread tightly woven are nonprofits that work tirelessly to meet the everyday needs of our residents. Our present context continues to challenge nonprofits to do just that. CCS Fundraising surveyed thousands of nonprofits at the start of COVID-19 to understand the immediate philanthropic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on nonprofits. I'm going to share a few things that they found. The study found that 63% of responding nonprofits cited a decline in fundraising since the start of the pandemic. 1 in 4 nonprofits reported a significant fundraising decline over this same period. And nearly 80% of respondents expected a decline in fundraising results for the remainder of 2020, with half of these organizations expecting a significant decline. In my work overseeing the investment management relationships nonprofits have with Bank of America Private Bank, I'm seeing decade-old nonprofits on the verge of closure by 2021, universities and colleges establishing emergency funds to support students who are food and housing insecure and lack the technology to access virtual learning, and nonprofit staff whose mental and physical capacity to help themselves and others is being stretched to capacity. So our present reality includes the broad realization of the racial inequities and that are present in everyday communities across the nation. Corporations like Bank of America are putting their stake in the ground with financial commitments of $1 billion towards social justice and establishing partnerships with nonprofits to achieve our goals, our shared goals, I should say. The responsibility to lead the way to racial equity is and must be one that is shared. Our panelists today will discuss their observations of how our current context and ways that corporate and nonprofit alliances are helping nonprofits to access the skills, funding, resources, and people to sustain and grow. So without further ado, let me introduce our dynamic panel. First, many of you know, and those who do not know should get to know, Rosie Allen Herring. She is the president and CEO of United Way of the National Capital Area. And Rosie has an extensive bio, and I'm only going to share a few snippets.
You don't have to share any of it. Let's just go.
You have to share a little bit. Just a little bit. Well, I am always in awe of the servant leadership that Rosie brings to every professional and also volunteer endeavor that she engages in. So before joining the United Way, Rosie was the managing director of the Community Investment and Engagement Division at Fannie Mae. And prior to managing director of Fannie Mae, she served as the National Regulatory Compliance Manager, Housing and Community Development. So moving on to Eileen Ellsworth. She is the president and CEO of the Community Foundation for Northern Virginia, and another powerhouse that we will hear today. And Eileen's journey into the nonprofit sector, I think, is such a wonderful story. So after working as an accomplished litigator, Eileen plotted her transition to the nonprofit sector by determining that the nonprofit sector was, in her words, the intersection between her purpose, gifts, and passion. And she ran Empower Girls that taught over 600 fourth, fifth, and sixth grade girls in Fairfax County Title I schools technology skills, and later assumed the helm of the Community Foundation, building the organization from a meager $220,000 budget to the multi-million-dollar foundation that it is today. And last and certainly not least, my fellow Prince George's County resident, Tonya Wellens, President and CEO at Greater Washington Community Foundation. And Tonya, like Eileen and Rosie, are true social justice leaders who lead by that mantra. And prior to joining the Community Foundation in July 2016, Tonya served as a political appointee for the Obama administration as head of global partnerships at the Peace Corps. She also spent a significant part of her career working at USAID funded capacity building initiatives during the immediate post-apartheid era in South Africa and the broader sub-Sahara region. And not to mention her more localized work commencing in 2010 when she founded the Prince George's County Social Innovation Fund. So those are just snippets, believe it or not, of a substantial history that each of these ladies bring to this conversation. So with that, let's launch into the conversation. So we are going to have a set of questions that I will pose to the panelists. And the first set of questions is going to focus on the operating environment that we are currently in. When I say the operating environment, our current health environment. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists to take about no more than 3 minutes to respond to this first question. So the nonprofit and corporate sectors are mobilizing in the face of COVID-19's impact on all aspects of life. Please share a successful example of what corporations and nonprofits are doing to mitigate the effects of giving in the Greater Washington region. And I shared some of the highlights of the impact of decreasing philanthropy. And I'm going to start with Rosie, move to Eileen, and then end with Tonya. So Rosie, please.
Well, good afternoon, Lee, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to be with all of our listeners today. And thank you to the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, both Todd and Ruth, for their leadership and getting us all together to have what I think is an appropriate conversation, but also one that's forward-thinking as well as we reflect. So in terms of your first question, in terms of what has happened and how we've mobilized, I think that I, along with all of the panelists here who are awesome in their own right, agree that we've all had to do things differently. And I think that we all agree that this is an unprecedented time in more ways than one. There is absolutely not one segment of society that has not been touched by this particular pandemic. And we're looking at not only the pandemic of COVID, but we're looking at the pandemic of systemic racism that continues to raise its head. So it's caused us to look at not only how do we address or respond to the crisis that we found ourselves in, pretty much starting in March, but that we still find ourselves in. So for us, it's been looking at our business model, certainly, trying to respond to the crisis and the needs that were there right away. We launched our emergency assistance fund that we already had available, but certainly we tend to bring it out during a crisis, and this was certainly considered one, and it's still considered one. We've worked with both of the partners that are on this call, as well with Community Foundation, as well as both community foundations, both of Northern Virginia and Greater Washington. And so for us, with the Emergency Assistance Fund, we had to look at what the needs were that needed to be met right away. And our first need that I think bubbled up for all of us was food insecurity. And so we found ourselves having to deal with that, not just for families, but with a particular emphasis on children. When we started to distance learn, we found that many of our children, especially those that are in communities that have some significant need or in Title I schools, found themselves missing the one nutritious meal or two that they would get in the course of a day because they really did get most of their nutrition from school. And then, of course, from the food insecurity for many families who found themselves without work, we had to look at those wages. Many are unrecoverable. and many who were going to work every day, but because of the industry challenges, have just found themselves being in need. So it's caused us to look at our model of what we traditionally would do programmatically around health, education, and financial stability, to make it then, of course, dealing with those areas of focus in the middle of the crisis. While we looked at also our next 5-year commitment that we were wrapping up, our first 5-year commitment that ended June 30th, another one started July 1st, with a huge equity focus that's a part of it. So for us, it's really been about partnerships. It's been about responding to the crisis at hand. We knew that there was a segment of our population that already had need. That need was exacerbated by this crisis, and it continues today. But we also found that there was new need, people who generally didn't find themselves in need that now needed to access services. And so it's been about responding to that. We're still in that crisis mode per se, although it's quieted down just a little bit. I don't want us to become benign and somewhat insensitive to it, because we don't hear or see the crisis every day because of the new sound bites, but that the work continues, and we have to not only get to what recovery looks like over the next, I think, 24 to 36 months, but we have to look at what our new normal, I call it our better normal, will be going forward.
Thank you, Rosie. Eileen, please share your thoughts.
Yeah, so I focused in on your question, Lee, about sharing some successful examples of corporations and nonprofits in their response to COVID-19. So I'll start with the corporate success story, and what we saw is that the corporate philanthropic response to COVID-19 was unprecedented. It was certainly unprecedented in the history of our community foundation. In fact, more than half of the donations to our COVID-19 response fund from Northern Virginia came from corporations and corporate foundations that had never before made a donation to our community foundation. And add up all of the corporate donations to the fund in total, it was 65% plus of the total we raised. So our view of this was that local companies literally led the philanthropic response to COVID-19 in Northern Virginia. We certainly had our share of individual donations as well, corporate donations, I just mentioned, other foundations helped us out, but the companies really stepped up. And we gave a lot of thought to why that may have happened. And I think it's because that when we and other community foundations, including Tonia's, launched our COVID-19 response funds, we all framed it similarly to the Seattle Foundation's fund, which said it right from the get-go when we launched it in March, we said it would support those who were most disproportionately impacted by the virus and its consequences. And the feedback from our corporate donors that we've gotten since they made their donation is that that focus is what really resonated with them. Even before we all understood, completely what those disproportionate impacts are going to be. And then quickly, I'll share what I see as the success in the nonprofit sector. And I'm telling you, I think they are the heroes of the day. The nonprofit stepped up, figured it out, managed every challenge, and literally built the plane while they were flying it. And when the scope of what we were facing was sort of seeping into everybody's consciousness in mid-March, we just got on the phone with our nonprofit partners. We spent days and weeks talking to our nonprofit leaders because they were the ones on the ground, right? They were actually seeing what was happening, and we just needed to understand that. And in a phrase, it seemed like they were just experiencing a perfect storm of drastically increasing demand and diminishing capacity to meet that demand. My view of what we did and what others on this call did, and really what the entire foundation world did, is that we not only garnered and got out the door significant support to these nonprofit partners, but we did it really quickly. And I think that made as much difference as the amount of the grants. There was a psychological impact to that, as well as a financial impact to that. Our nonprofit partners didn't feel like they were alone. They felt like they were going to be supported through this, and that made a big difference. When I look at what's happening in all the other sectors, COVID-19 is leaving no one untouched. And the nonprofit sector is certainly being impacted, but I feel in general that the social sector compared to the other sectors, private and government, is at this point holding its own, and due in no small measure to the outpouring of generosity from individuals, companies, and foundations at every level of philanthropy.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you, Eileen. Antonia, your thoughts?
Sure. So as to not be repetitive of what's been said already, because I agree with everything that's been offered, I'd say that again, that partnerships is the sort of the name of the game for us. March 13th is an important day, I'd say, for many of us in the region, particularly those of us in philanthropy, because that was the day when many of us had moved to remote work. And it's also the day when our sector began to have weekly calls to really begin the essential work of organizing, sharing our intel, thinking through who would do what, being super strategic as to, again, to work collaboratively and to not duplicate efforts, and to make sure that everyone in our region, or as many folk in our region, were covered and taken care of. And so while all of us had emergency response funds, I'd say we did our absolute best to work in partnership and to work collaboratively. A number of things also resonate for me as it relates to how the corporate sector stepped up. So we received over 1,100 individual gifts to our regional COVID-19 response fund, raised more than $10 million. The vast majority of it came from corporations. There's just much more giving capacity from the corporate sector than many of our individual donors have the ability to do or to make available. But there are a few things that I think are just worthy of note. And to Eileen's point, focusing for us on disproportionate populations that would be impacted was an important driver or an attraction for funders to our fund. But also we made a special decision to focus on organizations that were led by people of color, recognizing as well that many of those organizations would also be disproportionately impacted, and that many of them were serving at a hyper grassroots level. And so I think that the emphasis on population served organization leadership really made the case for why the corporate sector might engage and connect with us. A couple of unique examples. IKEA is one. We just had an announcement just last week. This week, today's Friday, of IKEA's gift to our fund, where they looked to reimburse states for the exact amount of unemployment benefits that their employees received at the beginning of the pandemic. And so they made a $1.06 million gift to the community foundation, our community foundation, and another one to a group in Baltimore, thinking about it as reimbursement. And we are then able to use those resources to deploy to the nonprofit sector to focus on childcare needs, food security needs, et cetera. Another interesting example, and again, this is a link to partnership, our colleagues in Northern Virginia, including Eileen's Community Foundation of Northern Virginia, Arlington, Act for Alexandria, and the Greater Washington Community Foundation were the partners with Amazon for a major gift to our region to really think through what the most urgent needs were. So I think when the sector sees us acting together, there's a stronger propensity to say, okay, let's partner with them, because they're working in partnership to make sure that all needs are covered. And finally, the nonprofit sector pivoted brilliantly. I think your numbers are absolutely right, Lee, in that we really had to focus on urgent needs. And so that meant that some of the organizations that were doing incredible work were not in a position to be the beneficiary of funding. And I think that's probably going to remain the case, unfortunately. And it's going to be something that we're going to have to really think through strategically for the future, as Rosie's saying, in the next 18 to 24 months. Some of our nonprofit partners will make it, and some will not. And it's going to be an important conversation that we'll have to prepare to have in short order.
Absolutely.
Yeah, each of you have spoken to the needs that have surfaced and that you have identified as top priority that your organizations have addressed. And I'm going to combine the next question with the ask of, can you identify an example of one or two pressing issues impacting nonprofits and how your organization has pivoted, amplified what it is doing to address that? And I picked up, Tonya, on your note of you decided to focus some of your dollars on organizations led by people of color. And I'm curious, when we think about racial equity and the issues impacting nonprofits, typically all of us know that nonprofits led by people of color are the most under-resourced. So when you think about this moment in time and the strain the nonprofits are feeling, that strain is amplified for those being led by people of color. So if each of you all could speak to, in your respective communities that you serve, what is an example of a pressing issue and how you all have pivoted or done something a little different or brought a new partner to the table to address that? And I'll go in reverse order and start with Eileen to mix up the presentations.
Well, I mean, you know, there's been a huge disproportionate health impact and economic impact on communities of color by COVID-19. And there's no question about it that the nonprofits best positioned to address those health impacts and those economic impacts are the ones that we're focusing on now more than ever, because there's just drastic need there. When I read your question, Lee, I went back to something a little more basic about, you know, what nonprofits need right now. And just in order to do their important work. And it's just never been more critical than now that supporters of those nonprofits, especially those that are addressing the disproportionate impacts of the virus, health and economic, receive donations. You know, nonprofits are businesses. They happen to have preferential tax status, but like any other business, they need revenue to function. And most nonprofits have one or two large annual fundraisers. They've been postponed, or they're now on a virtual platform where there's just fewer opportunities for folks to engage. And their business models have been weakened, not in all ways, but in some ways by the pandemic. So we are all in the process of reinventing our business models. What that means from our community foundation's grant making efforts is that we were already heading in this direction even before COVID-19 was a thing. You know, we're flexible funding to our grantees, but since COVID-19, we've moved entirely to that model, and every dime coming out of our discretionary funds are going to be flexible funding. I think now more than ever is a time to trust our grantee partners. And the question reminded me of a TED Talk by Dan Pallotta that he gave about 7 years ago. And I think it was called something like The Way We Think About Charity is Dead. The words dead wrong and charity was in the title. And basically his core message is that we hand our most complex, persistent, and difficult social and civic issues to the nonprofit sector to solve, while simultaneously starving them of revenue to get the job done. You know, there's this idea that continues to persist that the leaner the nonprofit organization, the better. You can't make a difference and you can't have impact without staff, without resources, and without marketing and communicating your impact so that you attract more donors for your important work. And I'll just leave you with this one thought on this question. You know, I've never liked the word nonprofit because all that word helps explain is what we are not. And not are. And I heard Tony Mestries, the CEO of the Seattle Foundation, the other day address this issue. And he was saying he hopes that word just drops right out of our vernacular and that it gets replaced with for impact, or actually for impact organizations. And I love that. I love that frame. I think it's important to keep in mind.
I couldn't agree with you more, Eileen. Let me toss the virtual mic over to Tonya and to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Again, I don't think I can stress enough how we as a local sector, we in philanthropy acted together. I think, again, the Friday calls helped us to just learn from each other and to influence each other and encourage each other, quite frankly. Most of the foundations in the region shifted project grants to general operating grants. It's pretty significant for us. I mean, you know, there's often this interesting distinction, even as best practice suggests that, you know, general operating multi-year funding is the best and good practice. Many of us haven't moved in that direction in our traditional grant making, but COVID-19 pushed us to do that and to do it quickly. I often have said that we probably did more shifts, I think, in how we approach philanthropy in the last, back then it was, you know, 6 weeks or 3 months. Now it's 6 months than we had probably in the last 6 years. I mean, we made some massive strides because we knew that people were at risk, and we wanted to mitigate it as quickly and as swiftly as we possibly could. My hope is that that we will not allow our guards to be let down, or that we won't miss the opportunity to continue to lean in with urgency around some of the issues that we are looking to respond to, but also some of the things that we did to be responsive in COVID-19, that we will do them ongoing. And that's for us too, us as a community foundation, but I think us as a sector generally. There's another point I wanted to make, and I think I lost track. So if I remember it, I'll come back to it. I should have written it.
All right, no worries.
It will come back to you. I know it will.
Rosie, floor is all yours.
No worries. And again, so much has been shared in terms of how we've all had to pivot from what we thought we were doing versus what needed to be done. And certainly we made that pivot as well as Your United Way. You know, for us, we were already on the journey of talking about health, education, and financial security and stability, and what that meant for many of our funded efforts programmatically. But during the midst of the crisis, what we found was there were new areas of focus still within those key strategic pillars that required our focus. And so we too had great strategic partnerships with a lot of our corporate partners who gave us the funds that needed to. We raised a little over $2 million to be able to support the crisis at the moment, and we'll continue to do that. But what it showed us was that we had some new areas of focus. For example, under health, we thought, you know, of course, we were dealing with some of the chronic diseases that this community was known for. While Washington has, again, some great monikers that make it a great place to live, work, and play, 6 of the top 10 highest earning incomes are in the area. You know, I would say unemployment is pretty much low on a normal day-to-day basis. Education is pretty high. We're known as a quote unquote fit city, even though it's really a region, if you will. But there are significant needs. And what I've found is most time when people look at those, call them Chamber of Commerce kind of references, they will tend to think that we don't have any problems as a region. And we do. What I'd like to talk about, and what I always encourage us to talk about, is the gap between those who fit into those monikers that really are positives, that make us a great place to live and work, versus those who don't have, because it's not a slight change from one who has to one who does not have. It is significant. The gap is huge. And so for us, it's really about how do we fill that gap. So we did have some partnerships as well that caused us to look at the ecosystem, if you will, of how we do our funding. And so for us, for example, we received quite a bit of corporate dollars as well, as Tony had talked about. A lot of it was Gen Op support, which was unusual without the usual metrics that come with how many widgets are you gonna, you know, save in terms of lives, if you will. But it also brought us to bring some non-traditional partnerships to bear. For example, for us, we received a contribution from an anonymous donor who really had an affinity for Windows Catering. And Windows Catering had to reduce 85% of their staff that they were furloughing at the time, that we were able to, with that contribution, bring their staff back to keep their kitchens open. But what we did was said, for the food they were preparing, we wanted it to go to first responders. So those meals, over 9,000 meals over about a 4 or 5 week period of time, went to 20 hospitals where there were significant first responders. And many of our first responders were working double shifts, triple shifts. And it also included not just the medical personnel, it included the environmental staff, It included the support staff, because a lot of times we were walking in hospitals, or you hear about hospitals and you think about the medical professional, but nobody thinks about that environmental or custodial person who has to do what they have to do to keep the hospital clean and free of COVID as well. So it caused us to look at things a little bit differently. And I'll say the final thing in terms of what we did differently, even around health, was not just feeding the first responders and thinking about the chronic diseases and the gaps that were there that were continuing to be exacerbated, but it was now mental health. What we found that there was an increase in mental health needs and services that were required across the entire region. There was an increase in domestic violence that happened across this region that caused us to now put dollars in that light as well. And so it just, again, evoked some different partnerships that we didn't necessarily have. We had in more of a general sense, if you will, but made it much more programmatic for us. So again, it blew what we were planning to do, what we were doing, with what do we have to pivot toward that was really and truly needed. And to Tonia's point, we believe that this work will definitely continue. We cannot, there is no going back to what we thought was normal. It really is about going forward to what our new normal and our better normal is going to be.
I agree.
I remember. Can I share?
Please, Tonia, please.
It was about cash. You know, I think one of the biggest quote unquote innovations of COVID-19 was the willingness for philanthropy to think differently, and our partners to think differently about the need to put cash in people's hands. And so there is a general comfort, I'd say, with food support, with utility to support, with things that people can track and trace. There has generally been a discomfort with philanthropy thinking about ways of making cash transfers available. And we did that to the tune of several millions of dollars through COVID-19. And I'm incredibly, it just makes me really proud, again, that we are moving in a direction where we understand that people have real needs, and that if you give people agency with the tools that they need, that they're going to make the right decisions for themselves and for their families. If in a good period, and if on a good day, people are struggling to make their rent payments or make their utility payments, we know for sure in periods of such high unemployment that they need cash to be able to make some of these decisions. And so our partnerships with both the private sector, who were keen on cash transfers, and our peers in philanthropy were just awesome. I'll mention BMC Cares, Bernstein Management created a partnership locally where many of, to make available cash assistance, direct cash assistance to many of their tenants and other people who were in low income situations who needed cash assistance. Just again, really thoughtful. I appreciate the thoughtfulness of many of our private sector partners, but also in our nonprofit partners in looking at ways to manage the significant increase in demand for services and support, screening, the thousands of applications that came their way to determine how to best make these transfers available. Lots of pivoting and lots of innovation in that space.
Absolutely.
Tonia, I'm glad you remembered that final thought. Very, very important notations. And as we move this conversation forward, the interesting thread throughout all of your comments are inequities that exist, and how each of you all and your respective organizations are thinking very strategically about how to address them and to be, I hate to use this jargon, innovative, but to do things that are outside of the norm for philanthropy, because the moment that we're in is outside of the norm. So it demands that we do things differently. And before we pivot to the next phase of conversations to really delve deeply into the racial inequity space, I want to check in on the chat box because we actually do have a question or two that I want to share. And one of those questions is that the audience member asked about the report that I referenced. And that report was done by CCS Fundraising, and I will share that report with Ruth and also Todd to be circulated to all of the attendees, as well as a follow-up report that they did that did an analysis of the internal impacts on nonprofits and how nonprofits have had to shift in terms of layoffs, in terms of benefits, based upon the size of the nonprofit and then also their duration. So I'll share that so that people can have that in their hands, and hopefully that will be helpful. So I think that's the only question for right now. So we will, ladies, move forward into the next set of questions that is focused on systemic racism, racial inequity. I'm going to ask two important questions, and this is obviously focused on partnerships and trying to understand, you all have talked about the different partnerships that have formed, that you all have brought together and have come to you. And I'd love for you to share the work that corporations have done to initiate partnerships or that you have initiated that are very much focused on bringing people together around systemic racism or racial inequities, again, in the greater Washington region. And this is a tough one, but it's an exciting moment because we are seeing not millions, but billions of philanthropic dollars that are being put on the table, not just by corporations, but by private philanthropy in, I would say, grassroots, localized work that we have not seen, at least I have not seen in my lifetime in philanthropy. And I'd love to hear, first I'll start with you, Rosie, since we ended with you, to get your thoughts around that question.
Sure. There are quite a few partnerships that I think have been, elevated at this point. I think that they were always there, and I think that there are still new partnerships to be had. So this work is not complete. You know, one of the things that I'm most proud of during the crisis, of course, is the opportunity to partner both with Tonia and Eileen, along with the entire funding community. You know, Tonia mentioned at the offset about our Friday calls, and I know that many of our Friday call-in colleagues are on this call as well. And what it did was it brought us all out of our individual silos to say that collectively we really must cover the community. And it then shifted not only toward the response in terms of the immediate need for us as a sector, it then shifted to what do we do about equity? Because of course, in the middle of that crisis, the George Floyd incident came up. And everybody then found themselves, either, reaffirmed with what we knew all along was really an issue in terms of where, African-American or minority wealth was. I mean, when we look at the data for the Washington metropolitan area, what we call our ALICE population, and ALICE is an acronym that stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, but Employed. And this is a segment of our population where they may actually end up going to work every day, but they just don't make enough to make ends meet. And for the District of Columbia, that's about 55% of the population. For Maryland, it's 39% of the population. For Virginia, it's 39% of the population. And of those populations, it's significantly minority-based. And so for us, in partnership with many of the funding partners, we were able to say, okay, now we're looking at equity as a lens for which we do our investment. But it also caused us to say, okay, well, who's covering health? Who's covering, financial stability? Who's covering the arts? Who's covering, education? And not any one of us had to do it alone, but collectively we covered the community. So there are lots of partnerships, and they continue for us as well in this light with a Care First for us at Your United Way, with Deloitte, as well as with EY, Pepco Holdings, which is an Exelon company, for us with Bank of America as well. So it's been partnerships that may have been there a little bit, but certainly have been grown through this crisis and through this work. And the equity work continues. I see us literally doing quite a bit of equity work going forward and bringing thought leadership, but also specificity in terms of the results that we then know that we've moved the needle on this particular issue. I am not one to talk. I do not like a lot of talk. I think there are a lot of smart people who are on this phone, but we need the results, because if you can't see it, touch it, feel it, then it's not real. And poverty for many is real. They see it, they understand it. And so for us in this sector of our professional lives, it really is about how do we move the needle to know that we've truly impacted those that need it the most, that typically will be the minority population, but we're not leaving out anyone. But then how do we know that we moved in the right direction, and what does success look like, and when will we get there? So I continue to challenge us to think about things in that light. And Eileen and Tonya have been great partners, along with many of the other funders that are on this call. I know Meyer is great with it. RAG has been great with it. World Bank, I think I see Lindsay on here, who's been great with it. Julia Bear Cooper, you name it. We're all on those phone calls. In fact, they had one today that I missed because I was on another Zoom. But every Friday for at least 3-4 months, we were literally talking about the issues and what the it was that made certain that we were moving the needle. And so we still hold ourselves to that same level of accountability every other Friday now. But Tony and I hosted those calls together for our segment of society for the last 5 months or so. And so it's a matter of how do we continue to keep this at the forefront so that this does not become a blip on the radar.
Exactly.
Excellent. Eileen, please share.
Yeah, so first I want to give a nod to another convening that was going on in addition to that every Friday morning convening, and that was our every Thursday morning convening, Tonya, where you and I and our colleagues, Jennifer Owens, CEO of the Arlington Community Foundation, and Heather Peeler, CEO of Act for Alexandria, got together. And what originally brought us together was that Amazon gift, but really it became a thing well beyond that. And I so appreciated just that collaboration. It was wonderful. So to your specific question, Lee, on partnerships to address systemic racism that include the corporate role in that, and to your comment, Rosie, on results, we have to really drive towards results. I would say this, so like any other complex social ill, it's going to take cross-sector collaboration to address it, or else really it's not going to change. And I think if we really took that in, it would drastically change the way we behave in the social sector. I think we'd work harder to engage the private sector in our thinking and in our work, and we'd listen more to the thinking of our colleagues in the private sector and the work that they are doing. So I think it's very important that we bring them into the table. And now there are convenings that are popping up across the region that are trying to do just that. They're inviting folks from the government sector, from the private sector, from the social sector into one room to talk about equity, to talk about structural racism, where it lies, and what we can all do together collaboratively to address it. You always see tremendous participation there from the government sectors in Northern Virginia. And you also see it in the social sector, tremendous participation in those convenings. But what you may not see a lot of is the private sector participation in those convenings. So if there was anything I would like to see happen, 100 and Fortune 500 companies participate.
Eileen, are you still there?
I think she froze.
I think so. So Tonya, while Eileen rejoins us, let's move to you.
Okay. So I'll just offer a couple of things. One, I think our region has been priming the pump around racial equity for a long time. actually before it became the thing to do. Lee, I'll actually harken back to the days when you were at the Greater Washington Community Foundation, and under Terry Freeman's leadership, you all instigated the Putting Race on the Table series when talking about race and racism and the inequities that exist, particularly for Black communities, but for Black and Brown communities, was not a thing. And so I appreciate the work that you all did back then, that RAG sort of picked up the mantle on and really worked to deepen both the philanthropic sector's appreciation of what it means to view community issues and community solutions through a racial equity lens. And then the work that has been done in partnership between RAG and LGW under Tamara Copeland's leadership, and the work that we did together, Rosie, with the other group that we were working with to bring the Racial Equity Summit to the table. So we've been doing the work in this region, to your point, Rosie. We've been trying to really invest in learning and understanding and what it means, and actually socializing, because there have been so many attacks over the years to issues like affirmative action, to racial equity, to things that in some people's viewpoint places sort of race on the table, when in fact we know that the disproportionate outcomes are not an accident. They are linked to systems that have been designed through historic discrimination, policies, and practices that have put people of color, Black people in particular, in a position to be on the receiving end of so many negative outcomes. And so in order to undo that, it means that even in an emergency, we have to think through how we respond through a racial equity lens. I so appreciate, again, the ability to work in partnership with both corporate philanthropy and with institutional and individual philanthropy in our region, because there are some organizations who were around our tables who are far more progressive and are far more, I'd say, ahead of the curve when it comes to placing race on the table or looking at their work through a racial equity lens. But it helped all of us kind of to move together in a way that sometimes, because of whatever the pressures are, maybe it's your own individual institutional pressure or an inability to get something through that you might not be able to do alone, that you're able to do when you work in partnership. And so we heard around our decision-making table, our grant-making decision-making table, which we called our steering committee, that there were certain things that we were able to do because we were working together that had they been working on their own, they would not have been able to accomplish. And so again, the value of partnership is understanding, but also the value of partnership is being able to make bold investments in a way that's signaling to your company that it's not that the territory isn't that dangerous, and that if you do it, you might actually learn something, which is what my mom always tells me. But you might also see impact in a way that you hadn't expected to or experienced it before. And I'll tell you, those conversations were not easy. Whenever there's an emergency, it is easier to place considerations around equity on the back burner. No, we have to go with speed. No, we have to go with the biggest organizations, who can work at scale. And, the answer is not necessarily, because if we know, again, that if we look at the organizational leadership across the sector, it also reflects some of the discriminatory patterns that we're trying to correct for. And so you have to be far more determined to address inequities even in an emergency. And I'm very proud that we're making the steps to do that. There's a lot more work to do, I would say, for sure. And I want to just give two quick examples. One, Care First.
Thank you.
Their partnership with us, as Rosie mentioned, Care First set up a fund at the Community Foundation to support health providers in low-income neighborhoods. And again, we're really proud of the work that they committed to doing to make sure that PPE gets to communities that need it the most. And PepsiCo. It was interesting because they were a new funder to the Community Foundation, but they were very drawn to us because of our ability to make decisions about organizations that were led by people of color and serving people of color. And so they designated their investment to us to serve that purpose. Again, I really just appreciate it. And some of this was pre-George Floyd killing, because that's another pivotal moment for us in the COVID world, the pre-George Floyd days, and then the post George Floyd days, or the days that we're in right now, where there's an increased focus on both economic injustice and the crisis of our democracy, which of course includes racial injustice.
Excellent. I think Eileen has rejoined us. Eileen, are you back?
I am back. Can you see me?
Yes.
I can, and I can hear you. Excellent. Well, I'm sorry we lost you. Did you want to finish your thought before we move on to the next question?
Okay, I was just wondering what question we were on. So
we're on the same question.
We're on the same question. So the only thought I would add, and I'm really sorry I missed Rosie's and Tanya's response, so I can't really play off of those. But you know, whenever you look at any complex social ill, it takes cross-sector collaboration to address it, or nothing ever really changes. And I think if we really took that in, it would drastically change the way the whole social sector behaves. I think we'd work a lot harder to engage the private sector in our thinking and in our work. And we'd listen more to their thinking and better understand their work, so that we'd be able to find more common ground. So, I mean, in terms of the corporate response in 2020 to racial injustice, I look at the demographic of our region in Northern Virginia, and it's one of the most diverse workforces in the entire country. And it's a global demographic. And so the corporate sector's workforce interests are very aligned with the goal of nurturing a more inclusive society with broadly shared prosperity. And that's very good news, right? The good news is that corporate philanthropy and the corporate workforce goals are all aligned with these goals we're talking about around racial justice and inequity. If there was one suggestion I would have for local companies, what they could maybe do a little more of that would help move the needle on racial justice and equity, I would say having more CEOs engage in the local cross-sector conversations that are springing up now to discuss structural racism, ways to identify it, ways to dismantle it. And I'm not necessarily putting that on the corporate sector. I'm really putting that on us. I think the social sector needs to work harder to bring the private sector in and make the case to them that they need to engage, you know, more broadly in community on that. So I think that would be my one add to the conversation.
Lee, can I tag on to that from Eileen in terms of how we as quote unquote the social impact sector, not the word nonprofit, if that's helpful, Eileen, and engaging others to understand what we do. You know, coming from corporate America, going to United Way, you know, people were like, oh my gosh, you know, like, you know, are you going to take a vow of poverty? You know, are you going to, you know, become a, you know, tree hugger, a bleeding heart? You know, what are you going to do? And I said, no, I'm in the business of philanthropy. And the same way that in a company, you have an ROI that drives things for your shareholders and for your investors. In this sector, we have an ROI as well. It's called return on impact for our donors, who are just like any other investor who has chosen to give us their resources, many of them smaller, but much more meaningful, if you will. In terms of, you know, at your United Way, we get small corporations that could be the $50 from a janitor who's chosen to try to do something to say that I have a part in making my community better. So when Eileen spoke of how we engage with the corporate sector and being able to help them understand why they should be joining us on this, and not in an obligatory manner, but that this is a part of your business model that should be a part of your business model that ensures you are successful in whatever line of business that you're in. And so it's really about how do we as a sector make the case, not as this is the right thing to do and I'm going to play with your conscience and make certain that you want to do the right thing. This is just like any other corporate decision that you have to make. This business line, at least I know for me at United Way, is a much more complex business model than people will ever understand. They assume, isn't it just this and this? No, it's not. It's a whole lot more than that. And in order to be able to do it and do it well and have the impact that we seek to have on the communities that we want to serve, it requires us to understand all of those segments of society that we choose to partner with and that we want to partner with.
Exactly.
We understand their strategic priorities and vice versa.
Exactly. Yep. I'll just add this one other data point. This group called the New American Economy issued a report on the economic impact of recent immigrants to the GDP of Northern Virginia. And do you know that small business that are owned by the immigrant population in Northern Virginia is responsible for 1/4 of the GDP of the region, or almost $58 billion.
Wow.
It's in everyone's economic interest, you know? And I think that is speaking the language of the private sector.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's unpack. You all have shared a lot of suggestions, a lot of recommendations and best practices around how you're working and how others are working or should work. So let's focus for a moment, and I've seen several questions pop up, so I'm going to try to address them as part of my follow-up. So one is there's sentiment across all of you all that the private sector needs to continue to be a player, and a strong player in multiple different ways. But what we recognize for philanthropy and then also for the private sector, focus areas come into sexiness and then they sunset and we move on to something else. So my question is first focused on philanthropy. Philanthropy is doing some outstanding things. You all are convening in ways that you never have before. So how, after this moment, and I think of September 11th, when we had this moment where we were coming together, where dollars were pouring in, and then that sunset, and folks seem to go back into their usual norms. How do you all envision continuing to operate the way you are operating now to propel that forward, and whatever forward looks like in terms of strong philanthropic support, strong collaboration, innovation? How are you all thinking about continuing what is working so that it goes into perpetuity and nonprofits and the community benefit from philanthropy and the public sector and other players operating differently? And I'm not necessarily going to call on either one of you all, but whoever wants to jump into that question, please feel free.
Well, I got to say, I feel that's probably the most important question in the whole event today is, you know, right now there's genuine interest in all sectors of our society to address structural racism, but the question is it going to last?
Right.
So if the question is, you know, how do we come together to overcome structural racism, talk about a complex social issue, you know, the results of 400 years of slavery, segregation, and discrimination, I think it's all about consciousness around the need to do it together and not in our silos. So what is that going to take? It's going to take humility. And I'll tell you, humility is not the social sector's long suit. It's not any sector's long suit, in my experience on the planet. You know, the impact of our work is interdependent, and we don't acknowledge that enough. So what can we actually do to keep up momentum? And I was giving this some thought when I read this question. And I think what we could actually do is we could engage in some mutually reinforcing activities that not only acknowledge our own work and our own impact and our own success, but that actually gives a platform to acknowledge the success and work of other sectors on this issue. It was Mahatma Gandhi said, you've got to sort of be the change you want to see in the world. Well, if you want the private sector to acknowledge the social sector's work, we can start as the social sector, acknowledging the private sector's work, acknowledging the work that local government is doing to make a difference on this issue. I think it's a recognition of circles of influence, right? That we may be in one, we are in one circle of influence, but we're hardly the only one. There are circles of influence in Northern Virginia that intersect with us and that don't intersect with us. So how can we build across those divides? How can we engage others that have these massive networks and are currently interested in this work to engage those networks in these conversations? How can we support and encourage them? So one thing we've done at our community foundation is we just did a round of grants under our Build Back Dream Forward initiative to all of the leadership organizations in the region, Leadership Fairfax, Leadership Arlington, Leadership Prince William, all of the volunteer organizations in the region, to encourage them to have these conversations in their networks. How can America overcome racial injustice and social inequities? There are several very influential and wide-reaching interfaith organizations with huge networks that often extend well beyond their own parishioners. We've just done a series of grants to them. And I think most interestingly, we just made a grant to a local media outlet because they expressed an interest in hiring up a journalist that's dedicated to reporting stories from local communities of color in our region that have just been historically underrepresented in the mainstream media. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be a long journey, but I think a shift that needs to happen is happening, that this is no longer top-down philanthropy. It's no longer top-down anything. That just doesn't work. We have to lift up the voices in the community that are being most directly and disproportionately impacted. And we have to shift our power away from the individual foundations and the individual philanthropists to the community as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Well said, Eileen. Tonya, Rosie, did you want to add?
Sure, I'll be brief. I think we kind of predicted things would begin to happen this way. So, and you mentioned, Lee, 9/11, when again the community came together, donations were pouring in, we began to act as a sector. I think our community and our country, quite frankly, when there's an emergency, we rise to the occasion. And it's a little tricky because, as we're rising to the occasion, there's still our own storehouses that we have to go back and attend to. And what's tricky is balancing the two, working on a concerted effort together for a long sustained period of time, and then making sure that you're minding the business of your social business. I think a couple of things are going to have to happen. One, we're going to have to agree together, I think, as a region on a few targets that we want to solve for together that have a racial equity lens, but it may be two or three of them, and look at them from both a policy perspective and a program perspective. There are some of our funders in this community who really just want to focus on policy advocacy. Let's align our policy advocacy agenda with the work that we're doing programmatically so that we can begin to track impact and actually begin to change policies and solve for some of these problems, because there isn't enough philanthropic capital to continue to just, put Band-Aids on them. I think that's going to be a super important next step for us as we're sort of transitioning to the next phase of COVID response. Really
Absolutely.
Thinking about what are those two or three things that we want to work on together ongoing, and commit to an agenda around addressing them and attacking them over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So Lee, for me, it's also very brief. It's really about accountability. Because a lot of times, again, without that accountability, people don't understand, or, even with good intentions, don't know how to really and truly move the needle. There is goodwill there, but we just don't know how. I will point to Prince George's County, where I live and where I have been for quite some time. The county executive has what she calls Prince George's Forward, which is really her COVID response. To how do we look at everything from a public policy standpoint to, with great specificity, those things that need to be done at a very granular level. And I think that as long as we're able to show with detail, with widening the table, because I think that, you know, a lot of times in conversations around a particular issue, yes, everybody jumps in for the moment because it's the new thing of the moment. But then when we think that the quote unquote newness wears off, then we sort of kind of all go back to whatever our norm was. We can't go back anymore. You know, you can't be comfortable anymore. We're going to have to become comfortable with being uncomfortable while we navigate these waters, and widening the table and bringing more voices to the table, coming up with specifics around public policy and or programmatic efforts, as Tony has shared, but also having the accountability, meaning that we have to report back to the community writ large on how and what we've done. And that level of accountability will not only keep people at the table, but it'll also keep the resources there to continue to move the needle and be realistic around, we can't right the wrongs of 400 years overnight, but we can do what we need to do to try to break down some of these public policy efforts that have gotten us to where we are at this moment. So accountability is it.
Mm-hmm. And as people, institutions seek to be accountable, there's also this inherent importance related to transparency. And in transparency means that if you're successful or you fail, you still share those successes and also failures. So when we're talking about addressing systemic racism and racial inequity, that's a really uncomfortable place to fail, because what failure looks like, we all see pictures of it now just across the media of what failure looks like. But how would you all suggest staying engaged and keeping others and institutions engaged when the potential for failure is there, but knowing that it's okay to take, if you will, one step back, to take multiple steps forward, because we're still continuing to move forward? So could you all speak to how would we bring more people to the table that just are afraid of that notion of failure? Rosie, when you're talking about accountability, and particularly for nonprofits that are dependent upon the philanthropic dollars that we're all talking about. If they admit failure, then the potential for dollars long term may not be there. So could you all speak to that?
Well, since I brought up the accountability, I'll go there. There's nothing wrong with admitting failure, because again, failure is a part of life. But I think it's how you talk about it and how you look at what you did that may not have necessarily gotten you to your goal. You know, I don't like the word weakness, because I just think that it's a negative connotation. I like developmentally, you know, developmental needs or where some other areas of focus may be, or where there may be areas of opportunity to grow and develop. And so when I think about accountability, what it's making us do when we have those tough conversations, talking about being uncomfortable, it's something that I said as a philanthropy funder years ago at Fannie, was we really can't have every organization sort of kind of individualized in their approach to the dollars. It's a shrinking pot of money. Those dollars shrink every year, but you have 700 organizations going after the same pot of money that continues to shrink. Why aren't you talking? Why aren't you working together? And so it's about us becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable with how do I partner and what does that look like? Partnership is not always going to be equitable, but it can be effective. And you have to also truly care about who you want to serve and what that looks like and what your part may be in it. And so when I used to pose, you know, why aren't you all looking at mergers and partnerships and collaborations? And it would be, well, who's going to be the ED? And I'm like, I don't care. But I just know that it can't be 700 organizations all saying that they can do this, coming for the same pot of money that's shrinking every day, because then it becomes, I don't believe in the approach of you get $2, you get $2, you get $2. It's not effective. I call it the peanut butter approach. You're spreading the dollars so thin the bread is, you know, breaking, and it's not impactful or effective at all. How about it? Maybe 10 of you work together, and then you get a huge pot of money to be able to do some great work because you're good at this, you're good at that, you have a great back office, but you're great programmatically, you're a good policy person. you work together on that particular issue, you can definitely move the needle, and much better than you could ever do alone.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Eileen, Tonya, thoughts?
I only add that, we're all in this business because of a broad range of systems failures. Otherwise, we would be focused on, parks, green spaces, trees, all the sort of the arts, the upside things, and not trying to secure the safety net. I also have a fundamental belief in investing in people. As we know, programs may or may not work, even with the best set of data or research or it having worked in another environment. Sometimes programs work, but I think that we have to keep a keen eye on people who are doing amazing work that you have faith in and confidence in, and who may have been able to demonstrate success in other sectors, or that you just, you have some good predictors that they're going to do a fantastic job, and you get behind them and you fund them and support them like you want them to win. The final thing I want to say that was related to the last question is, it's always interesting when you think about the corporate sector in Greater Washington, because we're such a politics and government town. And for many of our corporate partners or corporations, the government relations office is here in the Greater Washington region. That's changing some, but it's largely still the case. I'd say at the height of the pandemic, the height so far, because we don't know if there's going to be another peak, our companies, our private sector partners did not behave like we were the government relations arm. They behaved like we were a part of their headquarters, or an essential part of their footprint. And what I want to make an appeal to for folk who are still on the call is that on an ongoing basis, engage with us like you're invested here, because I know many of you are. But if we can think about, how do you engage with your companies in a way that they think about DC, Maryland, Virginia, not just as a place for government relations, but as a place where you all are embedded in the community, and that where this community has real needs and has a chance at addressing and getting right, I think we all stand to win.
Eileen?
Well, all I'm thinking about here, when you ask this question, Lee, is how do you become a better person, right? It's self-examination. So how do you become a better organization? Self-examination. I was lucky enough to participate all summer with the design team, a small group of community foundations that were convened by this group called CFON, which stands for Community Foundation Opportunity Network. It was led by Terry Mazzani, who's the former CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, and he's the current Chief Philanthropy Officer at the Greater Atlanta Community Foundation. And this group of community foundations from across the country spent the summer discussing the community foundation industry, its post-COVID-19 work, and what needs to change to make us better advocates for racial justice and equity. So, it's a particularly difficult issue for community foundations because it requires us to reconcile a dissonance that occurs between the history of community foundations in America. We are agnostic philanthropic banks, sort of agnostic intermediaries for local philanthropy, with the urgent need and genuine deep desire in the community foundation industry for action on racial justice and equity. So, what this means for a community foundation, we're going to school on that now. What does it mean for our thinking? What does it mean for our asset development? What metrics are we going to decide to track to see if we're making progress? But most importantly, I think it is pointed out for us that we have a role to play in this, but it is not a leading role. It is a supporting role. And in this process, there's challenges and opportunities, right? And the challenges I think I've just described, and the opportunity is not just around how we might redirect our existing discretionary assets. And it's not just about how we might develop new discretionary assets. It's about our donor advised funds. So, for example, last year, our community foundation granted out a total of $13 million in grants. 12 million of that was from our donor advised funds. So it's a conversation we have to have about with our donors, with the donors to our donor advised funds, about what we can do to engage them in this work as well. It's not just about assets under management for a community foundation, it's about assets under influence. And that I think has been a great process for me to engage in and has helped us understand our role going forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And ladies, you know, I hate to end this conversation, but we are at this moment where we do have to start to move towards closing remarks. And I'm going to ask each of you all to respond to this question in your closing remarks. If you were to identify one thing, it could only be one, that you said to the private sector, that I would like you to do X to help nonprofits to address racial equity, to sustain and grow. You can finish that sentence however you like, but just one thing. Because as we think about this moment where on my side at Bank of America, and you all have heard that there is an exorbitant amount of discretionary dollars that folks are sitting on, cash that wealthy individuals are sitting on. And to your point, Eileen, these are individuals that are thinking about not how do I invest that into my portfolio solely, but how can I think about giving those dollars away? And what are the mechanisms that I'm going to use to do that? So while I say the private sector, I'm thinking about corporations like Bank of America, but I'm also thinking about business owners who are now thinking about what their philanthropy needs to look like because all of the cash that they are sitting on. So ladies, again, what is that one thing that you would say to the private sector that you feel could make the difference in helping nonprofits to sustain and grow, address racial equity, whatever the rest of the sentence is? Rosie, I'll start with you.
You would start
Good
with
choice.
All righty then. So a couple of things. I'm going to cheat because I know you said one thing and I'm not going to give you a laundry list. I'm not. But the one thing that I would say to be it a corporate partner, for-profit entity, business, you name it, the one word I'd use is partner. If you will partner with us, that can take the form of several iterations. It's not just cash. So yes, I know it sounds weird for a nonprofit who truly needs cash and contributions and investments in that light to say, I don't leave with that because I'm going to earn that from you. But it's also, when I say partner, then that's partnership not only in terms of the contribution, but it's partnership in terms of the thought leadership and bringing those ideas to the table. It's partnership in terms of volunteer engagement and what you can bring to the table with your workforce around a particular issue. It's partnership in a myriad of ways that says for this particular issue, for this particular segment, we're able to move the needle and make certain that we're having the impact that we seek to have on those that we seek to serve. So it's going to be, I'm asking people to partner, because if we partner, then everybody brings something to the table, and that's something that everyone can do.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Tonya?
So I'd say, again, I'm a big believer in leadership development, that you get behind good leaders, whether they are individuals who are out doing organizing work or advocacy work, or leaders who are in nonprofits or foundations, and support them like you want them to win. There is going to be so much work that we will have to do over the next long period ahead to restore our democracy, to focus on racial justice, to become economically strong, that we are really going to have to get behind, smart people who have a notion about, how to repair, how to rebuild, how to reimagine, how to recover. like nothing else. And so that's my answer. Put your money behind people in nonprofits, in philanthropy, and individual leaders who are out trying to make a positive difference, and support them like you want them to win.
Mm-hmm. Eileen, you get the privilege of the last word.
Well, it's going to sound, you know, I've hit this theme today already, but if it was one thing I would say to the private sector about why you need to support nonprofits doing this work, it would be this: work to appreciate our shared economic interest in an inclusive economy. The jury's in on that. The case is made. And if you just work harder to appreciate that, and come to a better understanding of how it's all in our best economic interests to do this work, you'd be much more interested in supporting nonprofits that are moving the needle towards that goal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, ladies, it has been a privilege engaging in a conversation with each of you all today. I want to thank you, Eileen, Rosie, and then also Tonya, for sharing your time and also sharing your insights and your ongoing commitment to not just your organizations, but really the communities that are so important to you and so important to all of us on the line. So again, thank you very much. And before we close out, I want to turn over the virtual mic, as I call it, to Ruth and thank her. And again, Todd, for convening this important conversation. And Ruth, as the interim president and CEO of Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, is doing awesome work in her role. And I want to give her the opportunity to offer final remarks to all of the participants. So Ruth, over to you.
Thanks so much. This has been an amazing conversation. I moved 3 times because kids had questions and needed hugs. But this has been a great conversation. And so first I want to say that I kind of saw the spirit of my great grandfather in all of you, because at some point in time, each of you sounded like a preacher. Even you, Eileen, we got to talk. And so I just want to thank you guys for like bringing that energy to the conversation. We're on Zoom. And so your passion and your energy definitely kept us engaged. Lee, thank you so much for moderating for us. We'll be using you again. You did an amazing job. And then Todd Pittman, who is our director of membership, member experience, who actually coordinated this entire call and has been looking at, you've been seeing him in the chat pod. He's going to be sending out a recording of this call. I know there were lots of nuggets here that folks want to be able to rewatch and learn from again. There will be a networking session that's happening after this. There'll be some breakout rooms. And so you can just click join once I'm done blabbering, and you'll be able to network with your colleagues that are here on the phone. I also just wanted to give a shout out to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Johns Hopkins University. We are proud to lead the Institute for Corporate Social Responsibility. This is another one of Todd's part of his portfolio, and we've been dedicating a lot of time and energy to ensuring that the ICSR program and the corporate affinity groups are focusing on racial equity. And so Todd has that as his mandate. And so the more that you engage in this work, I think the stronger and the smarter we can be together. And so as Rosie said, we're not coming out and immediately asking you for money. We might start off with just thought partnership and learning together. Tonya raised that as well, that professional development and leadership development. And so we want to be able to house that work here at RAG. And so we appreciate your support of that. Lastly, we do have the annual meeting coming up at RAG. And so we hope that you will join us and support us. It will take place on Thursday, November 12th. And you'll be receiving a save the date soon. You have to forgive us for this late notice, but I just came on as interim CEO, and we are putting our foot to the pedal and producing a great annual meeting for you all. So I have no other comments. There is a link in the bottom in the chat box for you to provide us with some feedback on today's session. I hope that you will do that. And Todd is now going to break us out into some networking rooms.